Footnotes and the margins. Do you read those? When you're reading a book, do you read footnotes? Sometimes, maybe. You know, when I was in a class in college, actually it was Gardner-Webb College some decades ago now, and my religion professor assured us that we could make an A in his class. We only had to do one thing, and that was memorize the book. You've heard me say that before. And what that meant was pay particular attention to the footnotes and to what's written in the margins, which is, you know, under photographs and things like that, because that may show up on a test. And believe me, it did many times. I got to thinking about the margins and whether they're really that important or not. And I got to tell you that this thought came to me because of Liddell's sermon a few weeks ago when he talked. I can't get that image out of my head, Liddell, of the bread on the corner of your plate. The bread that wasn't wanted because it wasn't what was the main feature of the meal. Riding on a train from Chicago to South Bend a few months ago, Teresa and I took a flight into Chicago O'Hare, then took the train down. From your perspective, it's down and around the tip of Lake Michigan and then over to South Bend, Indiana. And I was struck. I'd never taken a train ride like that before. And I was struck because the train tracks run along the edges of the towns, right? You all know this. I didn't grow up in a place where that was the case. I grew up in the country. The train was far away and through the middle of the countryside. But as we took that train through and around those towns, it became clear to me that we were on the edges of the communities. We were on the edges, the margins, if you will, of those towns and cities. And those towns and cities where we were going through on the margins, those houses located by the train tracks, clearly those houses by and large were worth less than those farther in. And the voices, I imagine, inside and outside those houses on the margins were seldom heard in influential ways. In this story from Mark, we find Jesus finds himself on and in the margins, outside Jerusalem, now outside his own place, and into the northern areas of the Gentiles, the Syrophoenicians. The place, we might say, where foreigners live. And out there, he's challenged. He's challenged by what he hears and what he doesn't hear. He's challenged to hear the voices and the cries from those inside and outside the houses on the margins. For him, it's the margins of Jerusalem and Judaism. For us, it might be the margins anywhere. The margins of our country, the margins of our state, the margins of our community here in Concord or Kannapolis or Harrisburg. And we too, as Jesus was, may be challenged by the voices from those inside and outside the houses on the margins, like the sidelines, perhaps, of the National Football League. Or the pregame show. And the playing of the national anthem. We may be challenged to hear the voices on those margins, or the ones still in the locker room taking a knee because of the inequalities that exist in the main areas. We may be challenged by the voices on the margins, like the sweatshops on the margins of places in Indonesia and Cambodia and Vietnam, where Nikes are made, where 80% of the people inside those sweatshops making less than $100 a month, many of them, 80% of them are women. Many of them make well below the poverty level even for their area of the world. We might be challenged by those in detention centers on the margins of our borders. Or we might be challenged by the voices coming from the Logan community here in Concord. It's interesting, this story in Mark, where Jesus indicates his own biases, his own prejudice. We see Jesus a little more human than that with which we're comfortable for it being Jesus. It's interesting that he indicates his biases about those on the margins. This woman, this Syro-Phoenician woman, this foreign woman, this child, this Syro-Phoenician child, this foreign child. And from this woman who will not be silenced, this woman like Maxine Waters on the floor of the House of the United States, will not yield her time. This woman persisted. And from this woman who persisted, this woman on the margins, this foreigner on the edges of Jesus' society, Jesus learns a little more the mystery of who he was meant and what he was meant to do and be. That is inspiring to me. What are we not hearing that we should be hearing from those on the margins? From this persistent woman, he learns to open his mind and think about things a little bit differently. Not just things, think about people a little bit. He doesn't even see this woman as a human being. Did you get that? Even if we use a different sort of translation on this, we can call it a puppy maybe, but a little dog. It's still a dog, it's not a human he's talking about. And from this persistent woman and her child on the margins, this foreign woman, he learns to open his ears so that he himself can hear what he may not be hearing. He learns to open his ears to hear a voice of the voiceless, and in this moment he becomes more the light of the world, the light to be followed into the margins of our society. So my question, the question raised by this scripture, as it was raised for Jesus, is also raised for us. And that is, what does this woman have to teach us? This Syro-Phoenician woman with her child. What do these women in Nike factories, not making livable wages, much less sustainable wages, have to teach us as privileged Americans who buy the shoes that they make? They get 2.5% of the shoe sale. That's down from 1990 when it was 4%. Their wages have actually, as a percentage of their product, have decreased since 1990. What does this woman in a Nike factory have to teach us? What does this man, whose friends bring him to Jesus and give voice that he cannot give to himself, have to teach us? This man may be like Colin Kaepernick, standing up, saying something that needs to be said, calling out the injustice of the country in which we live, at great peril, financial peril to his own self. What does Colin Kaepernick have to teach us about who we are as a country, as people who call ourselves Christians, as a church who says we are a social justice, social action church? What does Colin Kaepernick have to say to us? And can we hear it? I find us very much in the same place Jesus was. Dare we listen to this voice? This strong black voice. I don't know if I've shared this with you before, but I'm going to take a short trip, I hope, back to Raleigh, Dan, where you and I were arrested. And we were not the only ones arrested that day. If I've shared this story before, indulge me. If you're hearing it for the first time, it's meant for you. And that is, as I watched this unfold, as we were about to be arrested over in Raleigh for protesting the legislature's immoral actions, particularly with regard to people of color and people living in poverty. I was standing across the rotunda from where all the other protesters were, or the ones who were possibly going to engage in civil disobedience that day a few months ago. Dan was over at the Golden Doors along with Reverend LeVay. And I was standing across the room from them talking to a woman who had signed up perhaps for civil disobedience, and she shared with me, I said, I guess we should go over where the others are. And she said, well, I'm not going to be able to do this today. I've got to make a trip back to Tryon, and I'm afraid we'll get out too late for me to get back at an hour early enough, and I don't want to be driving after 2 a.m. I said, oh, okay. I said, well, and about that time, Reverend LeVay, this strong black woman, started speaking. And I leaned over to this person next to me and I said, let's see how long it takes for the bullhorns to come out after a strong black woman starts raising her voice. 2 minutes, 3 maybe, 5 at the most. We had been there a few weeks earlier in the same sort of situation with more people being louder, and it took 20 or 30 minutes for the bullhorns to come out. But you let this strong black woman raise her voice to injustice in this country, and immediately it was silenced. And so you know what happened after that? Dan took up a chant and raised his voice for her. And when they took Dan away, I raised up my voice for her. And when they took me away, somebody else raised up their voice for her. This woman in our story raises up her voice. Jesus hears it and responds and forever changes. Not only has he changed what's acceptable food to eat, now he changes who are acceptable in God's eyes as people, and it's every human being. What does Nike have to teach us? with its voice of asking Colin Kaepernick to appear in its ad as a strong voice against injustice against blacks in this country. I think Nike has a lot to teach us there. And we have some things we need to teach Nike too, like pay a fair wage to your workers. It's both and, though. It's not either or. Yes, Nike's voice needs to be heard in this ad. Yes, we need to hear the voice of Colin Kaepernick and respond to the injustices happening in our country. And yes, Nike needs to hear our voice saying, pay your workers enough to live and sustain their lives in a better way. And here's the thing about Colin Kaepernick and all of this, is if you can't imagine Jesus, where do you imagine Jesus with him? Because if you can't imagine Jesus taking a knee with Colin Kaepernick during the national anthem in this country, protesting the injustices against people of color, if you can't imagine Jesus taking a knee with Colin Kaepernick in protest of the racist inequalities in our systems, in our history, and in our laws, then you're probably confusing your Christianity with your country and following Jesus with following a flag.
Amen.
But take heart if you are confused. Jesus was confused too about this woman's worth. Jesus struggled too, and to his credit, he listened. He listened to her, and he was able to hear others as well raise their voices. He learned from her the mystery of what he was meant to do and be. When the footnotes and the margins become as important as the body, then you are not far from the realm of heaven. Let us pay attention to the voices on the margins.